We've seen a lot of changes on the PTR, and we've done a lot of testing, so I feel like we can confidently adjust the tier list to what I think is going to be meta, and what I think is going up in the lift, and what is going down. So let's first start off with one of the major changes compared to our last list, being Demolock, or Destro Warlock, sorry. Destro Warlock does so much AoE right now. They are just too far ahead of everything else in terms of damage output, being uncapped with their Rain of Fires and everything, that they definitely are getting an S tier spot for next season. Unless they're gonna get changed, I feel like Destro Warlock is gonna be a solid S tier. There's no way around it. Their damage is just absurd at the moment. I don't really know where else to put it than in S tier. Now, obviously we have Shadow Priest, which is joining them right next to them. And we already kind of see a pattern forming here, which, I mean, it's going to look an awful lot like Season 2, to be honest. And I'm not sure if I'm too happy about it. But first of all, we have our two biggest S tier contenders. And we actually see, and this is interesting, because initially I figured Fire Mage would be a definite S tier contender. However, I'm kind of revisiting my thoughts on Fire Mage, because there's a lot of dungeons where they do well, but I feel like they're not doing as well as a Destro Warlock or a Shadow Priest, which is making me want to put them in A+ rather than in S tier. Now, I'm probably gonna get a lot of hate for this, but I don't think that Fire Mage is an absolute S tier contender. You do not want it pretty much in every dungeon setup that you can have. You want a very specific comp in order to play with a Fire Mage. Don't worry, they'll buff Fire Mage just in case that happens. Probably. Probably. Now, but for real though, for Fire Mage you kind of need a specific comp, which makes me want to put them in A+ rather than an S tier. Because it's just a bit harder to work around, which these two classes have a lot less issues with. Like, you're way more comfortable playing a Shadow Priest or a Warlock in any comp than you would be with a Fire Mage. So, we are starting to see a pattern here. Although, I do think that Fire Mage dropping a little bit is a good thing. So, I like where we're going. For Arms Warrior, I still feel like the damage output from an Arms Warrior is really, really good. They do both good single target and good AoE. They do lack a little bit on the utility front, so I don't feel comfortable putting them in A+, but I do think that they're definitely an A tier class for next season. Like, the damage output that an Arms Warrior does at the moment on the PTR is really, really high, and the lack of utility you can compensate for. If they were to have a little bit more utility, I would put them in A+, but because of that lack of utility, I think A is a good spot for Arms Warrior to be in. Now moving on, Fury Warrior. Initially, for Fury Warrior, I was pretty confident that it was going to be an A tier. However, after some excessive testing on the PTR, I'm not really too happy with the state of Fury. Now, they are pretty much in the same boat as Arms Warrior when it comes to utility. However, both their single target and AoE damage is just significantly worse. And I'm not talking about a little bit, but I'm talking about a lot worse. So, unfortunately, we see Fury Warrior drop all the way from A tier down to C tier. And unless they are gonna get some tuning changes, I don't feel like they are likely to recover from how they are right now in terms of damage output. It's kind of sad because I'm a Fury Warrior main, but I guess it's gonna be an arms angle for me. Alright, for the rogue specs. I mean, rogues always are a little bit of the Swiss knife type of classes. They have a lot of utility. Their damage output is alright, but I don't think that Assassination Rogue is quite up there. They do good single target damage. They have some isolated damage in good windows. However, I don't feel like their damage output is good enough. Besides that, they are quite squishy compared to the other rogue classes, making me want to put them in B tier. Now, the same goes for Subtlety Rogue. However, Subtlety Rogue does have a lot more AoE potential than Assassination Rogue, which is gonna make me want to put him ahead of Assassination Rogue. However, I don't feel like they are in a spot good enough for them to be A tier or higher. Now for Outlaw, it's an entirely different story, however, because Outlaw is, well, I mean, we've seen it this season, and their dominance is gonna stay pretty much the same in the next season. They're still really good, especially for a lot of the dungeons that we will see. So that makes me want to put them in A+ tier. Their damage output is really good. They have that Swiss knife. They have that Swiss knife utility that I was talking about with the other rogue classes. However, I just feel like their damage profile fits way better in the dungeons that we're gonna get, and potentially with the comps that we are gonna play, which makes me want to put them in A+ tier, and I feel quite confident in that decision. So let's keep them in A+ tier. A+ too high, solid A tier though. I think that Rogue, especially Outlaw, is gonna be good. I think Outlaw is gonna be A+. Their damage output is just really good, and the damage profile as well. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like A+ is a really good spot for Outlaw Rogue to be in. I feel like they're doing really good this season, and it will continue on in next season. And they're a bit of a flex pick. They do require less of a comp to be played around, like Fire Mage does, but their damage output is really competitive. And like I said, they have really good utility as well. All right, moving on. Let's talk a little bit about Windwalker Monk, yeah? Where's Windwalker? Here we go. Windwalker is a bit in the same spot, I feel like, as both the rogue specs, both Assassination and Subtlety Rogue. I think they do have some usages. However, I don't feel like their damage output is good enough for them to be a solid A pick. They do have a little bit more utility than Arms Warrior does, or a little bit less than both the rogue specs have. However, the damage output is decent. I think they're definitely better than Fury Warrior. I don't think they're better than Arms next season, but I do think that B tier for Windwalker Monks is a pretty good spot for them to be in. I don't feel like they are an A tier pick. I think there's better classes. I don't think they're the worst pick, especially if you're not playing with a Mistweaver or you're going with a melee comp. However, I don't feel like they're just good enough. Now that we talked a little bit about Windwalker, I feel like it is time to talk about Augmentation. Now, Augmentation is a bit of a weird one, because Aug is a really, really good spec, because it brings a lot of survivability. It works really well in some comps, but it also works a little bit less well with some other comps. Now, if we are taking it purely on meta comp, we should put Augmentation in A+. If we're talking about on your average M+ group, I feel like A tier is a better fit for Augmentation. Now the question is, are you going to be playing it in meta, or are you going to be playing it in a normal group? If we play it in a normal group, like I said, it's going to be an A tier. If you, however, play it with a meta comp, then it's moving up to an A+ tier, and even an S tier whenever you play it with Shadow Priest, Fire Mage, or Shadow Priest, Destro Warlock. Then you really see that value from an Augmentation Evoker skyrocket up. But whenever you just play it in any comp, I feel like A is a good place for Augmentation to be in. I think they bring good utility for the group. If you have a good Evoker, you really notice the dungeon in terms of survivability being a lot easier. However, for your average group, I feel like A is a good spot to be in. Now, Red Paladin. This is the class that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And Chrysor is probably like watching me right now, thinking what I'm gonna do with this. But I feel like Red Paladin is gonna be an A+ tier. Their damage output is really solid. They do a lot of damage, and their utility pushes them up to that A+ mark. Now, if it were only for their damage, I would put them in A tier, right next to Arms Warrior. Their damage profiles are really comparable. However, they have that extra utility in the form of Freedom, Bubble, Bob. They just have a lot. more than what an Arms Warrior, for example, has to offer. And combining that with their damage output, I feel like they're a solid A+ tier, and they will be a really good melee class for either combat res, or if you need some more utility and still solid damage output. Now, talking about another class, Munkin. Now, Munkin is a bit different, right? Because I feel like Munkins have a really solid DPS output. They have some utility. They are a bit squishy, and they do kind of require a healer to babysit them a little bit. And especially now with the Mistweaver nerfs, I do feel like a lot of people are gonna prioritize playing Resto Druid over a Mistweaver. So I feel like Munkin is actually going to go down to top A tier. This is purely because of their squishiness, and that we are going to see more Resto Druids in play than we were last season. If it were not for that reason, we would see Munkin right up in A+ tier, because their damage output is really good. However, it requires way too high key levels for Munkin to start to become good. Especially with that long ramp time in lower key levels, you are just gonna have a bit of a pain in the ass with your damage output in such a short amount of time. Let's talk a little bit about Survival Hunter. Yeah, Taylor, thank you for the follow, dude. Let's talk a little bit about Survival Hunter, shall we? Because Survival Hunter, I feel like once again, Survival Hunter just isn't it. I feel like they're right on par with like Fury Warrior at the moment. Their damage output is mediocre. Their survivability is really mediocre, which actually makes them a little bit worse than Fury Warrior at the moment. They have some niche usages. However, I feel like this is not going to be the season for Survival Hunter. I'm sorry for all your survival enjoyers out there, but yeah, not this season. You guys had your fun in Season 4 Shadowlands. Now, when we're talking about Hunter, I feel like Hunter is a solid B tier pick. They have a lot of on-demand burst. However, they're really squishy, just like with the other Hunter specs. Like I said, they do have good on-demand burst. I just don't think it's gonna be enough for them to both live, do damage, and their utility is also not quite there. They are definitely better than Survival Hunter, which is making me want to put them in B tier. I don't think they're quite good enough to be A tier, but I think B tier is a solid place for Hunter to be in. Exceptional on-demand burst? Yes, but the problem is, with on-demand burst, especially on the higher key levels, the value of on-demand burst starts to fade away, like, a lot. Like, on-demand burst is really good in your weekly plus 20 keys, but whenever you go any higher than that, like, they cannot sustain the damage that they're putting out. It's a lot of on-demand burst, however, the pack will not die in your burst window. So, I think it's a lot less good than you would think, especially because a lot of people play the PTR on like plus 10s, which is the equivalent of a plus 20, and stuff will just die way too fast for an Hunter to really reach that wall where they are not killing the pack in a timely manner. Now, when we talk about dragons, Devastation Evoker. Now, Devastation Evoker is an interesting one, because their aggro is absolutely scuffed right now. So it is a bit hard to test dragons properly, because, well, they pretty much gain aggro if they send their burst within the first 10 seconds of the encounter. However, their damage output is absolutely insane, especially with their utility that they have as well, and their ratios being built in. I think they are a solid A tier pick. They do a lot of damage output. They have that niche utility. They have the Poison Dispel. They have the Cauterizing Flame, Rescue. Like, they have a lot of tools that can really help you out in M+. I feel like they are on par with Augmentation, and in some instances even better than Augmentation. But whenever you see the meta comp, then Devastation kind of drops down a little bit. However, with their damage output, I do think that they're a solid A tier pick. Moving on though. Moving on. Let's talk a little bit about Unholy DK. Now, the damage output of an Unholy DK is really solid. I don't think they are as good. I do think that their damage output alone puts them in a solid A tier, especially in next season. However, they are not quite up there with like a Red Paladin or an Outlaw Rogue. I feel like their damage output is a little bit too much revolved around pet. They can do a lot of damage in a really short period of time, and if you play correctly around an Unholy DK, they can be a really solid pick. Besides that, their survivability is great, they have some niche utility, and I think they are a solid A tier pick. Now, whenever we talk about Frost DK, however, we see a drop down to B tier. Now, Frost is good, it's okay, but I don't think it is as good as an Unholy DK, and I think it's right up there with the other classes like a Windwalker, an Assassination Rogue, a Sub Rogue, a Marksman Hunter. They have their damage output. They are better than Fury Warrior and Survival Hunter, but they are not as good as the classes in A tier. Now, once again, they have their niche utility, but I don't think it is quite good enough for them to be an A tier spec next season. Alright, moving on, BM Hunter. BM Hunter is a little bit of a weird one, because for their damage output, I would put them in A, because they are a really solid DPS output class. However, their survivability throws a bit of mud in that plan, which makes me want to put them in top of B. Now, we've seen it this tier as well. Their DPS output is absolutely massive, right, in this season. But their survivability just doesn't allow them to be good enough in order to be picked on those higher key levels. If you're playing BM Hunter in lower key levels, you're going to be absolutely giga fine and you're probably going to be topping the meters. However, whenever you start going up, especially with the dungeons that we're getting, with a lot of sustained damage output, like think about Knockout second boss, for example, they just drop off significantly because of their survivability. They do not really have the defensives to counter the stuff that we're going to encounter in the next season, making them a lot less good of a pick. They don't really have any useful utility. They have some niche utility, like for example their Trank Shot, their Frost Traps. They could be good. However, I don't feel like they're quite good enough to be an A tier spec next season. And it's a shame because they actually have a really solid DPS output, but their defensiveness is just not there, and that just breaks their class. Let's talk a little bit about Feral Druid, yeah? Because Feral Druid, it's... I feel a bit sad, because like I feel like Feral Druid is never really getting the shine that they deserve, which is gonna make me put them in C tier. I don't think they're good enough to compete against a Boomy. I don't think they're good enough to compete against the Resto Druid. They are right down there with Survival Hunter and Fury Warrior. They could have their niche scenarios where they are good. However, they need a very specific comp in order to actually get the maximum value out of a Feral Druid, in my opinion. And I don't feel like their survivability or their utility quite compensates for them just not being in that spot where they are a bit more open to be taken in multiple comps. Alright, Enhancement Shaman. Now, whenever we talk about Enhancement Shaman, it is pretty much a similar thing towards this to this season as we are going to see in next season. Shaman is just, at the moment, Enhancement Shaman, I mean, not quite good. Like, the damage output is not amazing. They should be that Master Funneler class, however, they're not really doing too amazing on it. They have some really solid ST DPS output in some cases. They can bring some utility. However, they are both squishy and their DPS output is not great, which kind of reminds me of Fury Warrior at the moment. They're just kind of down bad and they are gonna need some help in order to rise on the rankings again. And I don't think we will see a lot of Enhancement Shamans next season, because especially of the ranged meta, and them just being a bit squishy and their DPS output not really being competitive, it's just, it's not just quite there, unfortunately, because I really do like Enhancement Shamans in my group, but yeah, they are more of an FX at the moment than that they are helping you time the key, unfortunately. Now for Ellie, it's a bit of a different story, however. Ellie has a really solid DPS output. They are a bit more survivable, in my opinion. I don't think they are quite as good as the A tier classes that we see. However, I do think that they're a solid B tier pick. I do think that their damage output is really good. I do think that there's niche usages for it. Ranged with a short kick. I think that their damage alone and them being a ranged player is going to make them B tier. They have that utility. I don't think they're quite as good to be an A tier class, but I do think that Ellie is good enough. Now, if we are gonna see some changes in terms of like what I said with the survivability, etc., I do think that Elemental Shaman could be on the A tier. However, for now, they are gonna be a solid B tier pick. All right, moving on to Demolock. And Demolock is actually a bit slept upon because everybody is looking at Destro because Destro is doing this much DPS output. However, people are really sleeping on Demolock. I do think that they're a solid A+ tier pick. Their damage output is really good. They have a bit more single target output in my opinion. If you play it well, it can really benefit your group. It's very tanky. It has their utility. It has some stuns in there. Combat Res, Health Stones. It is just a really good, solid spec to play right now. I do think that if you are going to go off Destro Lock, you would still rather pick either a Paladin, Outlaw Rogue, or a Fire Mage. However, I feel like if you really want to go for that Warlock, that a Demolock could be a really solid A+ tier pick. Now talking a little bit about F-Lock, like, I mean, do we really need to talk about it? That's more the topic. They're gonna be a D tier once again. F-Lock is just the neglected Warlock spec of Blizzard at this point. I feel like at this point they might as well remove it from the game because they are just constantly kind of garbage in M+. I don't really understand why they don't give F-Lock a little bit more balance compared to the other Warlock specs that we see. Sure, they are going to do a lot of damage on the first pull in Academy because of their Seed of Destruction, I believe it's called. But they just really do not have much to offer, especially compared to the other Warlock specs. And to be quite fair, I don't think you will ever see an F-Lock in M+. And if you do find one, well, my condolences, pretty much. Because, well, I mean, he must feel really bad for not being invited into a single key. I really don't understand why Blizzard allows this class to be this bad for this long. Like, for as long as I can remember, F-Lock has just been the worst out of all of the 3 Warlock specs. I really don't understand why they don't give them something to be a little bit more competitive. Like, at this point, and I can tell this to you guys know this as well, if you see an F-Lock in your signups, let's be honest, you're not taking him. And it's kind of sad to say, it's the same with the C tier classes, like, let's be honest, but like with an F-Lock, it's just like that extra bit on top of that. If you find one, bullet them into it. No. Blizzard has decided that FE is only good in PvP. I really don't know. Like, what I said, I genuinely don't understand how Blizzard allows this spec to be this bad for this long. Like, I genuinely don't understand. I feel like this class has been neglected for way too long. Now, it's the same with Fury Warrior, in my opinion. Fury and Arms are also being neglected. Feral Druid is being neglected. Survival Hunter, like, is even more neglected. Same with Frost Decay. However, they are a little bit more competitive, at least. Like, this class, you just... I don't know. Like, I don't see any instance where you would bring an F-Lock. I really don't. Alright. Let's talk about Frost Mage. Now, I don't think Frost Mage is quite as good as a Fire Mage. I do think that their AoE output is a bit better. If you're not playing the Flame Strike build on Fire Mage, obviously. I do think that they have some cool usages of their Glacial Spike. For example, in the last boss of Brackenhide. It really makes those totems really easy to shoot through. Like I said though, I don't think that they're quite as good as Fire Mage, which makes me want to put them in A tier. I do think that they're a really solid spec, just like with all the other Mage specs. However, they are not as good as Fire Mage, but they have their niche usages. And we actually saw some people play Frost Mage after in the later part of Brackenhide in season 2 it was, where they would port out, swap to Frost to have that Glacial Spike for the last boss. And I think that's really one of those bosses that Frost really shines upon. Talking about Arcane Mage. So, I am basing this because I haven't seen an Arcane Mage in M+, right? In PTR. So, I'm going to base this on what Hardjack told me when I was playing BTM with him. He told me that Arcane Mage is gonna be really, really solid in next year, and that's a definite underdog. He said it will not quite be as good as Fire Mage, but it will be really, really strong. And there are some really cool usages for some of the things that Arcane Mage has in their kit. And especially with the spell steals and stuff that we're gonna see, Arcane Mage is quite the underdog, and I think that they're a solid A tier because of that. Now, do I think it's better than Frost Mage? I genuinely don't know. I do know that Fire Mage is gonna be the top contender for the Mage specs. However, I feel like both Frost and Arcane Mage are gonna be really, really solid specs to play next season as well. Now, obviously, it's always the same with mages. Every tier mages are pretty much the favorite child of Blizzard. So if you want to be always meta, just play a mage at this point. And if you know all three of the specs, you will be meta at least every season on one of the specs. I'm not really happy about that. I think that if they put half the time they put into balancing mages into other specs, that we would actually see a way more balanced game. But yeah, I mean, what can we do, right? What can we do? All right, moving on. We only have one last DPS. And that DPS is Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, Havoc is a bit of a special one because Vengeance Demon Hunter is this absurdly good right now that they are pretty much never going to be taken. And that's kind of a shame. Because I do feel like Havoc Demon Hunters, even after all the nerfs that they've received, that they're really solid classes to pick. However, unless you're going to be playing with a bear, I don't think that you'll be playing with a Havoc Demon Hunter. Now, the damage output is really solid. They do have some niche usages, which makes me want to put them a little bit ahead on the B tier. However, you will most likely never play them because Vengeance Demon Hunter is a thing. Now, Vengeance Demon Hunter is an entirely different thing, which we will get into right now, because that is our next S tier. I don't think I have to explain a whole lot about Vengeance Demon Hunter and why they are S tier. They have the 5% magical buff, they have tons of utility, they are unkillable, their damage output is through the roof, and the fact that you can just CC a pack alone for pretty much half a minute just by yourself, that's absolutely ridiculous. In my opinion, for Vengeance Demon Hunter to be somewhat balanced, they're gonna need to make some changes to the talent tree, making them choose between survivability and their utility. Because the way that it is right now, double Silent Sigil, double Fear Sigil, Chaos Nova, and their double Grip Sigils, it's too much. Now, if you combine it with Oppressing Roar, you just have a 10-second Silent Sigil. If you compare that with like all those S tier classes, you do not need a single kick in any dungeon. I feel it's very toxic for the game because the skill level has dropped significantly from players right now compared to other seasons where they would actually need to interrupt stuff. And yeah, just in general, like I feel like Vengeance Demon Hunter, what they've done to the utility of it is a really bad thing for the game. It has significantly decreased the skill cap for anyone playing a caster that would have to deal with these things before, and now they just have a Vengeance Demon Hunter to take care of it. I think it's a bad thing for the game, and I really hope that they either nerf it into the ground with those utility usages, or they make them choose between either utility or survivability. I don't think that having Vengeance Demon Hunter be the way that they are right now is healthy for the game in pretty much any instance. I mean, they either give every tank similar utility to what VDH has, which I also don't agree with, because I feel like it takes a lot of skill away from like the DPS players and the healers. In my opinion, the way that it was before Vengeance Demon Hunter was way better, where you actually had to coordinate stops, coordinate your kicks, and right now, you just basically don't even have to play the game. You're basically hitting 5 target dummies. Because the Vengeance Demon Hunter is just gonna do all the heavy lifting anyway. Besides that, you're gonna be able to pull so massively with all the casters, which you are just not able to do with any other composition. Which, Yeah, in my opinion, it's just really toxic for the game. It's really unhealthy. It really is unhealthy. But yeah, that's my take. All right, moving on. We got Bear Tank. Now, I feel like Bear Tank is a really solid A+ tier. The survivability that the Bear has is really good. Next year, they are going to get their Season 2 setback, which is going to help them even more. I feel like they're very survivable, they have good utility, they bring that combat rest to the group, which allows you to play something else as well in the healer slot. And just in general, the first buff, I think it's a really solid A+ tier. I do think that we're going to see quite some bears returning next season. However, with the current state of Vengeance Demon Hunter, I just don't think that it's going to be enough for them to be competitive to them, and most people will still likely opt in for that Vengeance Demon Hunter spot. Now, if you're playing with a melee comp, I do actually believe that a Guardian Druid might be the better choice for you, especially whenever you're playing with like a heavy melee group, with like a rogue, warrior, maybe an Enhancement Shaman. Now, I wouldn't necessarily take an Enhancement Shaman in the current state that they are, but hey, who knows? All right, moving on. Prot Warrior. Now, Prot Warrior is it's kind of down bad. Like, it just hasn't really. It just really hasn't gotten anything this season, or it hasn't really gotten anything next season, which makes them even closer comparable to either Guardian Druid or Vengeance Demon Hunter. I don't really think that it's going to fit well in the comps either. So I think they are going to be down in C tier, unfortunately. I don't think we will see much play. I don't think they're as competitive as the other tanks, and they just don't bring enough to the group in order to make them a viable tank coming into the next season. Now, moving on, Brewmaster. Brewmaster, my friend, Mordim is best class. Now, unfortunately, once again, Brewmaster is just not good enough. They are, well, I think it's safe to say that they are the least tanky tank that we have. And their DPS output is great. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, they have great DPS output. They are fast tanks. They have some utility. They bring that physical buff into the group. But they just die. They just die to pretty much everything. In order to be able to play Brewmaster on any higher key level, you're going to need an Ulk and a babysitting healer in order for this guy to be able to live. And I think it's kind of sad because I really do like Brewmasters. I think they're really fun classes. I really liked the melee setups with a Brewmaster. But yeah, just like with Prot, I don't think that they bring enough to the group, and their survivability is just really not great. I would maybe even put them down into D tier, but I do think that their damage compensates somewhat for that fact, and in the lower key levels they are not as bad to play. But whenever you move up a little bit higher, you're gonna notice really quickly that you're just gonna be dead on pretty much every pull unless you're gonna manage your defensives really properly and you have a really good healer. Which, yeah, I would love to see Brewmaster's return, but unfortunately, it's not the case for next season. Alright, moving on, Blood Decay. Now, I don't know too much about Blood Decay. What I did hear, though, is that they're not gonna be as good again in next season, which is gonna make me put them in B tier. I do think that they are better tanks than Prot Warrior and Brewmaster at the moment. They have a little bit more survivability. They do a bit better with bleeds, which is gonna be a bigger thing in next season. They have that combat rest. They have that niche utility that could really help you out as a group. I do think that they're better than Prot Warrior and Brewmaster, but they are nowhere close to being a Guardian Druid or a VDH. It's not looking too optimistic if you're playing a Blood Decay for next season either. Unfortunately, because once again, just like with Brewmasters, I actually do really like to play with Blood Decays. Maybe it's a little bit still from Season 4 Shadowlands, where Blood Decays were just doing more damage than DPSs themselves. However, this season is not going to be the season where they're going to start out DPSing people again. Yo, Bambles, thank you for the follow. Alright, Pro Paladin. For Pro Paladin, we're going to see A tier. I think they're a really solid pick for next year. They bring that utility into the group. I think they're decently survivable. Their DPS output is decent. I don't think they're quite as good as Bear. And that makes me want to put them a little bit below that. I do still think that they are better than Blood Decay, however. I do think that they could be an A+, but I still think that Bear Tank is just a little bit better, making them put in A. Now, moving on to healers. And for healers, we actually did see some tuning changes lately. And that has actually changed it up a little bit from my original idea of what it was going to be. Now, I might get some shit for this, but first of all, we have Resto Druid in the S tier. Resto Druid is really, really good at the moment, especially whenever you combine it with the VDH, bringing you that combat res, the versatility buff still. Their healing is really good for the dungeons that we're going to play, especially if you think about, for example, Ruby Life Pools, last boss. They will not have pretty much any of the issues that the other healers will have, meaning that you will not be locked out of your heals whenever the interrupting cloudburst happens. I do think that their healing profile is really good for the dungeons that we're going to see, and just in general, their DPS output is really solid. I do think that in the meta, we're most likely going to see everybody play Resto Druid. I do still think that there's place for other healers, but Resto Druid is kind of the best right now whenever you look at healers in the current meta. Even though Mistweaver has been nerfed by 13%, I still think that they are going to be A+ tier. Now hear me out. Monk has a really solid DPS output. Their ability to instantly top, their utility that they have, physical buff that they provide, I think that they're really solid healers. I don't think that they're quite as good as Resto Druid anymore, especially after those nerfs. I do still think that they are really solid healers, making them a little bit better than your average healer. And quite frankly, I don't really understand all the doing that has been going on about Mistweaver, because Mistweaver this season was so far ahead of everything else that even a 13% nerf still makes them better than the other healers, which is quite ridiculous in my opinion, because that just goes to show how imbalanced the healing meta actually is. And if you look at Mistweaver in this season, in my opinion, it was almost healing in easy mode, like the healing that you would do just by pressing your buttons, press sprint and crane kick 50 times, and everybody is stopped. I think it's kind of ridiculous. I'm happy that they nerfed it. I don't think it is enough for them to be in line with the other healers, which is why they are still A+ tier. I think their healing output is really good for the dungeons that we're going to get next season, but I do still think that Resto is going to be better after those nerfs. Alright, moving on, Preservation Evoker. Now, Preservation Evoker is actually a funny one, because I have played with some Preservation Evokers on the PTR, and I kind of reconsidered my idea about Preservation Evoker. I think that Preservation Evokers are a massive underdog next season. Their damage output is absolutely solid. I don't think they are quite as good as Mistweavers, which is gonna make them be an A tier healer. They have some niche utility, like the Bleed spell in certain dungeons. The downside with Evoker healer is that you need your entire group to be stacked, which works a lot less well with healers or with ranged players than it works with melee. If we would see more melee players or more melee specs on the top of the board, I would actually be down to put Preservation in A+ tier. However, because we see such a ranged heavy meta once again, I feel like it is not quite up there yet with A+. However, I do think that they really have solid HPS output, solid DPS output. They have the utility. And I think in some scenarios it's really beneficial to have a Preservation Evoker if you do not have that Devastation or Oak in your group. Especially for dungeons like a Brackenhide or with a dungeon like Academy. Resto Shaman, unironically, is a really solid spec. And I feel like they are going to be an A tier spec as well. They have solid DPS output, solid HPS output, and they have some good group-wide utility. Now, I don't think that they're quite comparable with Mistweaver or Resto Druid, and I think that they're a little bit behind Preservation Evoker. Not enough for them to be B tier, but I do still think that their damage and HPS output will guarantee them a spot and A tier. I'm happy with that choice. I do like Resto Shamans. I think that if a Resto Shaman would have a combat res, that would be absolutely massive. I don't really know why they haven't given every healer at this point a combat res yet. Would make the game a lot easier. However, bringing the Bloodlust, bringing some good group-wide utility with their totem giving you 10% more HP, and I just like Resto Shaman. I just like it. Now, moving on. Holy Priest. Holy Priest, I've gotten a lot of comments on this the last time that I put Holy Priest way too low up the list. And that people were saying like, oh, Holy Priest is going to be an A+ tier. Holy Priest is going to be meta. However, one thing that people don't understand is that Shadow Priest is pretty much a locked-in spec. And then you're going to need to make the choice, am I going to play a Holy Priest or am I going to play a Shadow Priest? And whenever you're faced with that decision, you are always going to play Shadow Priest. Because a Holy Priest is not that good where you would want to pick them over a Shadow Priest. I do think that their HPS and DPS output is really solid. I don't think that they're going to be as good, but I think just because of Shadow Priest being in the current spot that they are, is going to bring them down to B tier. If you really want to be playing the game as much as possible, I don't think playing any of the other priest packs other than Shadow Priest, unless Shadow Priest is getting a nerf, is going to be too good for you in terms of getting invited. I think it's a bit sad because Holy Priest has a lot of potential, but it will never shine purely because of how unbalanced Shadow Priest is at the moment. Moving on to Disco Priest. Now with Disco Priest, it's pretty much the same thing as with Holy Priest. They are not going to get their time to shine in M+, because of Shadow Priest being there. I do think that Disco Priest is also a very solid pick. However, once again, with Disco Priest, besides them doing damage, some HPS, and bringing a PI, they don't really bring anything else. And Shadow Priest already covers that PI, making their value drop down quite significantly. Now, if you are choosing to play without a Shadow Priest, like I said, I do still think that these two classes are really viable and would probably move up to an A tier, and for Holy, maybe even A+, because of their solid DPS output and HPS output. But just because of this class, they will not get the time to shine. Very much the same as with Devastation Evoker, Augmentation Evoker, what we saw in the last seasons. Even though it is a really solid spec, they will just not see the game time purely because of Shadow Priest. Short question to Holy Priest. Doesn't they have Master Spell too, like Shadow Priest? They do. But like I said though, Holy Priest and Disco Priest are getting outshined so hard by Shadow Priest because Shadow Priest is so unbelievably broken in the next season that, in my opinion, you will never want to run any dungeon without a Shadow Priest. Like, this is an insta pick. Like, it fits in pretty much every comp. It is an insta pick because of their damage output, PI, Mass Dispel, which brings the value down of these two classes significantly. Alright, whenever we look at Holy Paladin, our last class, I don't think that they are quite as bad as an F-Lock. I do think that they are a C tier class though. I don't think that Holy Paladin is as good. They are playable. I do think that they are not really bringing anything to the group other than a melee kick, which a Resto Shaman does pretty much better on a range kick. I don't think that their HPS output or DPS output is anything noteworthy. I don't feel like they are gonna have the time of their life. After the rework they've done to Holy Paladin, it has not really been able to recover, and I don't feel like it will in Season 4 either. Unfortunately true, but I think that's the current state of things right now with Holy Paladin. It's a bit sad, like I said though, because I also do like to play with Holy Paladins. I just don't think that they're quite good enough compared to the other healers that we have out there. After a lot of testing on the PTR and taking into account the recent changes that we had to the healers, I feel pretty confident about this, and I do think that quite some classes do need help. I don't think that Blizzard is going to help them as much since this is a faded tier. However, with the current meta, it's... I'm not too sure that I'm too happy about the way that the meta looks currently, and it's pretty similar to what we've seen in Season 2 and also in last season, where one comp is very likely to just Giga dominate in M+, leaving the others quite far behind.